This is not a rumor. This is not speculation. This is Formula One, changing its own rules mid-season. After just 3 races, drivers didn't just complain. They pushed back. Together. And when that happens in Formula One, something is seriously wrong. We're talking about cars losing half their power instantly. Dangerous speed differences on straights. And a system so unpredictable, even world champions don't trust it anymore. At the same time, viewership is collapsing. Nearly half the audience gone in just 3 races. And behind closed doors, the FIA has already started rewriting the rules. Quietly. Urgently. But here's the part no one is telling you. These changes aren't just about fixing a problem. They're about control. Because when drivers force the FIA to act, the balance of power shifts. And that changes everything. Who wins? Who loses? And who actually controls the future of Formula One? Subscribe now? Because what really triggered this revolt is something most fans haven't even noticed yet. At first, the FIA didn't react. Because this is Formula One. Drivers always complain. About balance. About grip. About strategy. That's part of the sport. It's expected. But this time, something didn't fade away. It kept coming back. Race after race. Session after session. The same message. From different drivers. Different teams. Different situations. And yet, identical concerns. That's when it stops being noise. And starts becoming a signal. Because this wasn't about performance. No one was asking for more speed. No one was asking for more power. They were asking for something much more important. Control. And when Formula One drivers start talking about control, you have a serious problem. Max Verstappen called it unnatural. Lewis Hamilton went from optimistic to openly demanding changes. Fernando Alonso said something even more revealing. He said the issue wasn't speed. It was unpredictability. And that word changed everything. Because unpredictability sounds exciting. But in Formula One, it's the opposite. It means hesitation. It means doubt. It means the driver doesn't trust the car. And once that trust disappears, everything else starts to fall apart. Braking points become uncertain. Overtakes become risky. Defensive moves become desperate. And races stop being pure competition. They become calculated survival. But here's where it gets even more serious. Because this wasn't just happening occasionally. It was happening constantly. Every lap. Every straight. Moments where the car felt normal. And then suddenly, it didn't. No warning. No pattern. Just a loss of confidence. And drivers started adapting. Not pushing at the limit. Holding back. Managing instead of attacking. And that's when the racing changes. Not visually at first. But fundamentally. Because when drivers stop pushing, the entire sport loses intensity. But this is where things escalate. Because behind the scenes, drivers started talking to each other. Comparing notes. Sharing experiences. And what they realized was the turning point. This wasn't isolated. This wasn't team-specific. This was built into the system. Every car, every setup, every strategy, dealing with the same core issue. And once that realization spread, everything changed. Because now, this wasn't feedback. This was pressure. Collective pressure. And in Formula One, that's rare. Very rare. Drivers are competitors. They fight each other every weekend. They don't usually align. But this time, they did. And when that happens, the FIA doesn't have the luxury of waiting. Because ignoring one driver is easy. Ignoring all of them is impossible. And that's the moment the situation flipped. From observation to urgency. From patience to action. Because what happened next is something Formula One almost never shows. The point where the drivers stop adapting and start forcing change. And this is where everything changes. Because up until this point, the drivers were reacting. Now, they started pushing back. Not individually. Not emotionally. Strategically. Because when drivers feel something is wrong, they adapt. But when they realize it's built into the system, they act. And that action didn't happen on track. It happened behind closed doors. In meetings. In conversations the public never sees. Where drivers stopped talking about setup and started talking about safety. And that's a completely different level. Because once safety enters the conversation, everything accelerates. No delays. No waiting. No politics. At least, not openly. And this is where the collective voice of the grid becomes powerful. Because one driver can be ignored. Two drivers can be questioned. But when the majority align, it becomes pressure. Real pressure. The kind that forces decisions. And that's exactly what happened. Drivers began pointing at the same core issue: energy behavior. Not just how the power is used, but how it disappears. Because this is the detail that changes everything. These cars don't lose performance gradually. They drop. Instantly. Half the power. Gone. In a fraction of a second. On a straight. At full speed. Now imagine being right behind that car. Closing in. No warning. No signal. Just a sudden difference in speed that should not exist. That's not racing. That's risk. And drivers knew it. They felt it. Lap after lap. And once that understanding became shared, there was no going back. Because now they weren't just competing. They were exposed to the same unpredictable system. And that's what unified them. Not frustration. Not performance. Risk. And when drivers feel risk they can't control, they don't stay silent. So the pressure increased. Stronger. More direct. Less patient. Until the FIA had no room left. Because at that point, doing nothing becomes the biggest risk of all. And that's when the shift happened. Quietly, but decisively. Emergency discussions turned into concrete plans. Technical ideas became real proposals. And suddenly, rule changes were no longer a possibility. They were inevitable. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because the FIA wasn't just reacting to drivers. They were reacting to time. There was no luxury of waiting until next season. No time for long development cycles. This had to be fixed now. Before the next race. Which means one thing. Everything becomes compressed. Decisions that usually take months, made in days. Testing that normally takes weeks, replaced by simulation. And in Formula One, that level of urgency is rare. Because urgency increases risk. And now the FIA is taking that risk to reduce another one. And that's the contradiction at the center of this entire situation. Fix instability by introducing change under pressure. And that doesn't guarantee stability. It just shifts the problem. But they had no choice. Because the alternative was worse. Letting it continue. Letting drivers lose confidence. Letting the danger grow. Letting the sport lose credibility. So they moved. Fast. Decisively. And controversially. Because what they are about to change doesn't just affect safety. It affects competition. Performance. Hierarchy. Everything. And that's why the next phase of this story is not about what the drivers did. It's about what those changes will actually do. Because once the rules start moving, nothing stays the same. And this is where the real consequences begin. Because changing the rules is one thing. Living with those changes is something completely different. Because the moment these updates hit the track, every team is thrown into uncertainty. Setups that worked might stop working. Strategies that made sense might collapse. Advantages built over months could disappear overnight. And in Formula One, that kind of reset is massive. Because this sport is built on precision, on small gains, on understanding every detail better than your rivals. But now, that understanding is being shaken. Because when you reduce electric deployment, you don't just limit speed. You change how drivers attack. You change how overtakes happen. You change how races unfold. And at the same time, when you increase energy recovery, you shift the entire rhythm of the car. When to push, when to defend, when to save. Everything becomes different. And that means one thing. No one is fully prepared. Not completely. Because even the teams that support these changes are stepping into the unknown. And that's where the tension builds. Because some teams were comfortable. They had already solved the system. They understood the energy behavior. They maximized performance within the chaos. And now, that chaos is being reduced. Which means their advantage might be reduced with it. Quietly, but significantly. And that's why this moment is so controversial. Because officially, this is about safety. And it is. But competitively, it's something else. It's a redistribution. A shift in balance. A reset no one asked for. But everyone must accept. And that creates friction. Behind the scenes. Between teams. Between manufacturers. Between those who benefit and those who lose. Because in Formula One, every gain matters. And every loss hurts. But here's where it becomes even more important. Because this isn't just about who wins the next race. It's about what kind of racing we get. Because if these changes work, we might see something return. Drivers pushing again. Fighting on instinct. Taking risks with confidence. Because they trust what the car will do. And that's the version of Formula One people connect with. But if the changes go too far, we get something else. Cars that are too controlled. Too predictable. Too limited. where drivers are managing systems, instead of attacking each other. And that's a completely different experience. Less raw, less intense, less human. And that's the balance the FIA is trying to find. Right now. In real time. With no guarantee. Because they are not just fixing a problem. They are redefining the limits. Of performance. Of control. Of what Formula One feels like. And that's why Miami is not just another race. It's a turning point. Because for the first time, we will see the result of this pressure. Of this revolt. Of these decisions made under urgency. And when the cars go wheel to wheel, we'll finally understand something critical. Did the FIA fix the problem? Or did they just change it into something else? Because if the racing improves, this becomes a recovery story. A moment where the sport corrected itself. But if it doesn't, then this goes much deeper. Because then the issue is not the rules. It's the direction. And once the direction is questioned, everything becomes uncertain. And that's the real risk. Not just slower cars. Not just different racing. But a Formula One that no longer feels like itself. And this is where everything finally comes together. Because up to this point, we've been talking about changes, about reactions, about pressure. But now, we're talking about consequences, real ones. Because what's happening right now is not just a fix. It's a signal that something inside Formula One didn't work the way it was supposed to. And once that signal is visible, you can't hide it again. Because think about what this means. A regulation designed for years, agreed by manufacturers, approved by teams, tested in simulations. And yet, it required emergency changes after just 3 races. That doesn't happen in a stable system. That happens in a fragile one. And fragility is the one thing Formula One cannot afford. Because this sport is built on confidence. Teams invest hundreds of millions. Manufacturers commit long-term. Drivers dedicate their entire careers. All based on one assumption. That the system is solid. That the rules are clear. That the direction is stable. But now, that assumption has been shaken. And once that happens, everything starts to shift. Teams become more cautious. Less willing to take risks. Because why invest heavily if the rules can change suddenly? Manufacturers start asking harder questions. Because long-term commitments require long-term certainty. And drivers, they start trusting less. Not just the car, the system itself. And that changes the dynamic of the sport in a way that's not immediately visible, but deeply important. Because Formula One is not just about racing. It's about trust. Trust in the machine. Trust in the rules. Trust in the competition. And right now, that trust is under pressure. But here's the part that connects everything. This entire situation started with unpredictability on track. Cars behaving in ways drivers couldn't control. And now, that unpredictability is spreading. From the car to the rules. From the rules to the future of the sport. And that's the real escalation. Because fixing technical issues is possible. But restoring confidence is much harder. And much slower. Which brings everything back to one final question. Not whether the FIA made the right changes. Not whether Miami will be better. But whether this new era was ready. Ready for real racing. Ready for real pressure. Ready for the reality of Formula One. Because if it wasn't, then what we're seeing now is not a temporary crisis. It's an early warning. And early warnings only matter if you act on them properly. Because if you don't, they become something else. Something bigger. Something harder to control. And that's the position Formula One is in right now. Standing between correction and escalation. Between stability and uncertainty. Between the sport it has always been and the version it is slowly becoming. So when the next race begins, and the cars line up, and the lights go out, you're not just watching a Grand Prix. You're watching a decision. A direction. A moment that will quietly define what Formula One becomes next. And whether this revolt was enough to save it, or just the beginning of something much bigger.